given the rise of AI and the incorporation of, well, not specifically AI, but modern technologies and the incorporation of AI and its a downstream application even into manufacturing, is it going to be harder for Africa's future development path for Africa to attract the labor intensive manufacturing industries that supported Asia's rise over the past century?
Thank you. Maybe I start with that very question. For the continent, the principal position has been whether you're talking about choices between regions, whether you are talking about types of industry that introduced to that to the top, whether you are talking about forms of political systems that Africa would underwrite Africa's rise to the top, whether democracy or non-democratic ones, whether you're talking about a developmental state and a non-developmental state. For Africa, it's not either or. For Africa, is a bit of both to different measure. Now, that principle applies to the area of digital transformation, this fast rise of digital technologies that promise to help Africa leapfrog many stages of development right to the top. It has shown it with regards to the adoption of the mobile phone and how the adoption of mobile phone has improved access to food and food distribution in the Horn of Africa, for example, how the mobile phones are helping people cope with conflict situations, especially in the Sahel, and they're able to ping each other and they're able to move and avoid the movements of these armed groups. Often, most of them are financed by big countries, and how the mobile phone is enabling financial inclusion in ways that's never been seen before. If you look at e-money, it rises most sharply in Africa before it rises elsewhere. It rises elsewhere as a point of convenience, but it rises in Africa as a matter of necessity. When there are no bank systems because of the war in Somalia, the Horn of Africa is a problem. They have now to figure out how do they harness the indigenous systems of transferring money without physically transferring money. How do they harness that, but now use technology? Then you have e-money, and the first one was called M-Pesa, and then there are many others that are now all over the world are there. So Africa has used digital technology already, first to solve problems, two, to accelerate technological innovation, three, to drive economic growth and entrepreneurship and financial transfers and so on. And Africa can also use it in many other areas. Of course, it comes with risks. And the risks, as you indicate, may be that it pushes up economic growth that is based on less labor intensive basis. And therefore, Africa may have to find answers for all this huge labor reserve that it has for all of that. Fortunately, digital transformation is not replacing the older industrial system. We're still going to have mining for ages to come. We're still going to have manufacturing in a normal way for a long period of time. We're still going to have physical markets, not just digital markets, in Accra, in Abidjan, in Addis Ababa, in Johannesburg, or any other places. We're still going to have labor-intensive elements all the time, coexisting with digital elements and all of that. That is why it's so useful to see how the African Common Free Trade Area conceptualizes it. And it released 2 years ago what it called digital trade value chains. And it talked about how they coexist with other value chains. And so there's an opportunity in respect of that. Now, moving to the issue of self-confidence, I put in the chart that really for Asia, Ghana and South Korea are independent around the same time and at the same level of development. And South Korea is going to take off. It's going to have the boom in the 1960s and the 1970s, and then it'll become a developed country by the 1990s. And everybody asked the question, why it is so? Besides the fact that colonialism doesn't actually leave Africa completely. So it lives, but it's still there. So what is called neo-colonialism continues, and it limits Ghana's rise and stuff like that. And South Korea does not have that. Instead, what it has is a former imperial power playing a supportive role in order to support that and its other wing, Japan and others, and it helps it to move. Even when China rises in the 1970s, the West continues to support that. On the African continent, it doesn't actually support that growth. But the real big differentiator between Ghana and South Korea is that the South Koreans belong to a civilization they have not forgotten. The colonial operation was only a temporary disruption, not a permanent dislocation. And therefore, the Korean, for example, in agriculture, use a civilizational logic called Samer Undong, which is very similar to Ubuntu in Africa and stuff like that. But they use that to drive their agricultural revival in the 1970s already. So they borrow from the West, but they nest it on their own cultural innovations in order to grow. And so their civilizational basis is not gone because that becomes the source of confidence. And the Chinese civilization is the civilization. The Vietnamese belong to a broader civilization of Southeast Asia. So they have not lost their civilization. They might have been delayed, they might have been humiliated, as Professor Ngaweni was saying earlier on. They might have been dead, but they were not, their civilization was not killed. That's a different story for Africa. You're now having to mop up with what African Renaissance. We're trying to cobble out of pieces of things that were completely destroyed. That even a country like Ethiopia, which was not fully colonized, finds that quite a lot of that was also still lost, because even without direct colonization, the colonial influence was total over Africa. The cultural renaissance, cultural confidence among Asians in different parts of Asia was also important for that self-confidence. And lastly, the Asians did not lose confidence in their potential, even after their power was broken, but their potential remained an inborn driver for them to rise. And as they made small step forward, they replenished their confidence all the time. And Africa does not have those conditions. It has to find a way around that. How do you regain your confidence without your civilization, without your self-belief, and without your heritage, using it to propel the future? And that's part of the things that we should all sit down and think, what are the creative ways we could do now under current conditions to enable that rise? But Africa would then have to rise in spite of lack of self-confidence and in spite of low confidence in Africa by others. And it will have to rise. It may have to rise through non-psychological means, that as Africa makes progress in material terms, that will build confidence in itself, in what it is able to achieve. And that's a huge task. That is why leadership is absolutely critical for Africa, because that's what is going to join, it's going to bridge the gap between lack of confidence and a dream to become a greater continent going forward. Thank you very much.
Yes, Ms. Muleta.
In regards to your question about manufacturing and labor intense, I think Africa still has a huge opportunity to the field of manufacturing. I mean, for instance, Ethiopia is still single digits in GDP from manufacturing. I believe it's somewhere like 6% or so. So we have a lot of materials being imported. And with a population of over 120 million people, it's very clear that the potential for manufacturing growth is there. And we do have over the years, we have increased investments coming from Asia, and it definitely has the potential of increasing. Agriculture seems to be what has been very big in Africa in general, and even in Ethiopia. Agriculture employs about 70% of the population in the workforce, and the GDP that it contributes to is significant from agriculture. About 35% to 40% of the GDP comes from agriculture. So it shows you that there is a huge room for growth. Obviously, there needs to be manpower training and skills and so forth, and labor intense. Manufacturing is more labor intense. So we have to have this shift. And also urbanization is also going to create that when regions are becoming more urbanized, lifestyles are changing, and so manufacturing will have a huge potential. So the fact that there is the need and the manpower makes Africa and Ethiopia in general a place good for investment for manufacturing. Overall, I believe that in every section, in every area, Africa has a room for growth. But I believe since the population also is predominantly young, I believe that technology is going to be very key. Like Dr. Sibmando just also mentioned that. So digital technology area is going to be a huge potential. So that answers that question. And to conclude about our conference in general, I think the fact that the century is Asia is definitely a great potential and opportunity for Africa. Like I said before, to learn, because we have a lot of things in common. And the fact that the history of Asia is somewhat similar with Africa, and it's more attainable because it's, I believe Professor Kishom also mentioned how it could be very hard, or it could be a bit difficult to visualize the growth of Western countries like Europe and the US, because it's been so long since they have reached the development. But with Asia, we can actually learn from the challenges, and we can also learn because of the diverse cultures and ethnicities that the continent has, and even migration and conflicts and so forth. All those things in combination makes it an ideal continent to learn from for Africa. So I think this conference in general opens up even more ways that we can collaborate for African countries with Asian countries.
Before we close, maybe let's ask you, Shaoli, just to make some comments as a media practitioner. In China, you are in a think tank space. You are engaging with people from all over the world. What is the feeling? What is the mood about what's happening in Africa and in the global South in general? What's the running commentary? Is it positive? Or in fact, there is still lack of understanding of some of the things that Professor Zondi was talking about just now?
There's been a huge change. So what China has lived through over the past 30 to 40 years is essentially centuries in many other parts of the world. Well, as Professor Zondi and Ms. Maleta were saying, in that Asia was never really colonized the way Africa was. But the memory of colonization, of imperialism, is very much alive. We've been criticized by Western media about how that remains the state narrative to sort of brainwash the young kids about how they've been victimized. It's not so much. It is very much alive. we spoke of a civilization before from Professor Zondi. It is very much alive in the spirit of everybody who live here in China being a great civilizational state, that how you've lived through that humiliation about a century ago. So it is a very much a living thing. It's not a brainwash propaganda. So that is what I think from the discussion that we had before is what drives the confidence, the confidence deriving from the drive to be successful, to grow. And then I think things begins to diverge about where people stand in terms of their worldview, how they think about regions from the rest of the world. Where it starts to diverge, you look at the different age groups. I think the older generation and the younger generation is very much different. And we'll focus maybe a little bit more on the younger generation today. The younger generation is very much outward looking. Now, I think in general, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, Chinese people are very inward looking. And it's not a sort of like a xenophobic way, but it's a very nice way that I put it, is that the Chinese people are very inward looking in the sense that we don't think about expansions. And I think a lot of the excellent thinkers of our time that we've all spoken to over the past few months, we've spoken to Professor Sachs about a month ago, and I've spoken to Professor Wang Xiangsui, a great strategist from Beijing very recently. It's not a rhetoric that China does not seek military expansion, and that if you don't believe in it as a diplomatic rhetoric, believe it in the history, in the culture, in the civilization. Most Chinese people are very pragmatic. And that is what I mean by inward looking. Now, the younger generation still inherits that spirit of inward looking. We are very much focused on, not we, but the younger generation of Chinese people or Chinese people are very inward looking in the sense that they're looking at what is pragmatic, what is in front of me, what serves this society, this population, and the growth of the Chinese people. But not only that, the younger generation, where they differ a little bit slightly from the older generations, that they are very much keen to learn about the rest of the world. They are forming not just a narrative of this civilization, of this nation, but a worldwide narrative. This is why, I mean, it was a bit out there when I made a comment about Nurja, but it is very much reflexive of why this particular animation, this film came out of China at this particular time, because the generation of people is looking at how do we solve the problems of the world today, not just China. China is a part of the world. So when you say that, how do Chinese people think about the rest of the world? I would say increasingly concerned, interested, and that is a very, very good thing. I mean, take our content, for example. So we are completely independent media, a think tank, intellectual content-based media outlet here in China. And increasingly, we are producing for the rest of the world because we want to share with the rest of the world what is the sentiment on the ground for Chinese people. How do Chinese people view the rest of the world? That is what we wish to do through Wave Media and the ChinaAcademy.org. But in China, the success of our content, we have made multiple videos from speakers like Professor Busani here from Africa, from like Kishore here, from Southeast Asia. And all of these speakers, their videos receive multi-million trending status here among the Chinese youth. People are interested, concerned about how do the rest of the world, how do people in the rest of the world think? How we come together to form a new world narrative. I think that is a very, very strong underlining drive with the new generation of Chinese people today. That is a little bit different than at the onset of the Chinese reform and opening up about 40 years ago. Back then, I think it was Professor Kishore just said that when he was growing up, he thought about how Asians are inferior. And I would say that sentiment somehow was alive back then in China too, but not anymore with the younger generation of Chinese people. So the communication, but having said that, this is why I think communication and webinar like this is so important, is that the Chinese youth are very eager to learn about Africa and to learn about Africa through genuine African voices, not through the mediation of Western media. and Western cultural products. And I think that will be a wonderful, wonderful century if we can just come together directly. And I stress directly.
Colleagues, thank you very much for joining this. We thought we should have this conversation about whose century is it anyway. Kishore has written 2 books that this is Asian century. The World Bank and former President Thabo Mbeki and others, when they were pivoting the African Renaissance agenda, were arguing that the 21st century is Africa's century. And of course, in the interventions by Zondi, Muleta, and Kishore, we've heard what people feel about the mood, the trends, as well as possibilities for claiming the 21st century. One important thing from their intervention that I have learned and I've seen in many other books is that it is not necessarily a negation of Africa's Renaissance or say this is the Africa's century if you argue that the 21st century is Asia's century. And therefore, it does not sound like a threat to Africa or the rest of the global south if you make an argument that this is Asia's century. In fact, in both his books, Kishore is very careful not to argue that the rise of Asia will mean the decline of the African continent or the global south.
Thank you so much. We wish to see you in South Africa very soon, or maybe sometime have you visit China.
Thank you. See you. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.